Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we're going to continue our reading of the driver story, but I wanted to highlight a few things first. Christians used drivers to reinforce the doctrine of Christianity. And drivers held so much influence over other slaves because they had more access to resources. It wasn't just the whip. They believed that there is wealth in people, and people were needed to work the land. Plantation owners wanted polygamy because drivers were breeders for the plantation economy. Drivers also bred followers. And here's some food for thought. Were rebels seen as enemies because in a world where food was scarce, when the rebels came through trying to liberate the people and they ate all of the enslaved people's provisions, were they seen as enemies of the enslaved because they were eating their provisions? I want you to also note that in some instances, female slave owners were punished by the fiscal more frequently than male slave owners for infractions. We learned that in the previous chapter. The power of the fiscals and masters were seen as divine. They thought that they got their power from God and that God imbued them with the ability to render out punishment and mete out judgment. However, slaves also had their own social political structures to address theft and minor infractions within their community. And then, when they found someone guilty of it, they would go and take things out of their home to equate for the things that they were alleged to have stolen. But can you imagine a situation where you're an enslaved person and you have acquired some few meager possessions, and those few meager possessions are now being taken because you've been accused of theft? You know, it's like saying debt is slavery, but being an enslaved person that goes into debt because of a crime has got to be 10 times worse. And we also learned that as drivers, they facilitated the practice of obeah for the plantation owners, and they had multiple instances of being able to help the plantation stay calm and cure things like poisons or miscarriages or different ailments that came up on the plantation throughout their lives. The obeah men would come and help the plantation owners. This was before they banned obeah in Jamaica. So these are just some things I want you to think about. We're going to go into chapter 4 now. On page 89, which is the beginning of chapter 4, the title is Unbounded Authority. When absentee owner Thomas Winter arrived to take up residence on his Berbice River coffee plantation named Deutichem in early 1829, he unwittingly set off a crisis that had been building for a decade. What began early one Sunday morning as a gathering of the plantation's enslaved labor force to welcome winter would soon devolve into a violent power struggle between the resident manager and a former driver that threw the plantation into chaos. At the center of this conflict was an enslaved African man named January, who had once been the plantation's head driver. According to January, their day of rest started peacefully as almost all of the nearly 300 slaves on the plantation assembled before Winter's front door to wish him good morning. January, who was not among them, watched from a distance as they stood in a row and said, "Good morning, master," and cheered. Although January was piqued that they had not waited for him, he went to join them. And even though the current drivers were present, January took it upon himself to represent everyone. He went through the crowd, entered the house, wished Winter good morning, and said, "We are glad to know we have a master." Playing the role of a big man, he asked Winter if they might be allowed to drink a dram at the door to welcome him. Winter agreed to this customary entitlement and sent his personal servant to get rum for the people from the resident manager, Mr. Boaz. The gathering at Winter's door took Boaz by surprise. He was at his own house at the time and thought it was odd to see the whole gang assembled in front of the owner's house, especially when he heard what he described as a huzzah from upwards of 200 Negroes, but he overlooked it. Boaz went about his business, leaving the plantation on the back of a mule to run an errand. Soon, however, Boaz's wife ran after him and told him that the gang had not simply assembled to ingratiate themselves with Winter or get some rum. "Don't you see," she asked, "the gang are gone up to their master's door to complain against you." As Boaz rushed to confront the assembly, he was intercepted by the man Winter had sent to get the rum. By the time Boaz approached Winter's house, he had come to see the gathering as a challenge to his authority. "I said," he later recalled, "if these people wanted a dram, I think they might as well have come to me for it." Having lived on the plantation for more than a decade and having worked his way up from the position of overseer, Boaz was evidently anxious about his status. According to January, Boaz cried out, "You dogs, who gave you permission?" and then ordered the drivers to make everyone shut their mouths before they could answer. Even then, Boaz later recalled, one man offered an explanation for having gone to Winter directly instead of him. January had told them not to do so. Enraged by this symbolic disregard for his authority, Boaz pushed his way through the crowd and walked up the steps to stand next to Winter and address everyone. Switching from Creole to English for the benefit of his newly arrived employer, Boaz began by berating his drivers. They had met with him less than 15 minutes earlier at his house to receive their instructions for the next day's work and their own customary drams of rum, and Boaz was troubled by what he saw as some sort of conspiracy. "You know I have lived so long with you," he said. "What is the reason of your going up in a body in this manner without giving me notice of your intentions?" He told the drivers he would withhold their rum for a week as punishment. Turning to the others, Boaz told them they were not to blame. It was the driver's fault, and complained that it was a pretty thing for a manager to be sitting in his house and hear about 200 people huzzahing, it being no holiday, without his having the least notice. Boaz then directed the Negroes to get a dram, flailing to assert some measure of authority even though Winter had already approved the distribution of rum. Then Boaz turned his attention to January, convinced that he was the actual ringleader. "What business did you have," Boaz asked January, "to prevent the drivers and the people from going to my house when they are actually doing so?" "You, January," Boaz demanded, "why are you concerned in this? You are not a driver." In fact, January had not been a driver for nearly 10 years, but he continued to exert remarkable power, enough to overrule the current drivers, undermine the manager, and ultimately provoke a violent confrontation and crisis of authority that would continue for more than a week. For white plantation authorities, there was always a risk that demoting a driver could be the spark that would ignite the combustible plantation system. Having invested someone with authority as a driver and having worked to get everyone else to respect him, they now had to reverse course and convert that person back to an ordinary enslaved laborer, or at least try to do so. Plantation managers therefore avoided gratuitous demotions, knowing how destabilizing it was to demote a driver and appoint a new one. In some cases, the driver being demoted was not seen as an effective leader anyway, but things were more volatile in situations like January's. In such cases, white authorities were confronted with the fact that a driver had earned authority over time through his leadership within the slave community, as we saw in the previous chapter, and sometimes they learned the hard way that a driver's authority could be impossible to strip away. Reconstructing the long history of January's case, juxtaposed with other cases involving demoted drivers, offers an opportunity to explore these often tense transitions of power and the nature of drivers' authority. Given that white authorities were reluctant to face the risks of demoting a driver, under what circumstances did drivers lose their position? What options did such drivers have for protesting their demotion or getting back at those responsible for their downfall? And how can we explain circumstances like the 1829 crisis provoked by January, where a long demoted driver could still count on the loyalty of his many followers? Paths to demotion. January's demotion and its decade-long aftermath was unusual because it was so well documented and because January lost his position for reasons very different from those most drivers lost theirs. In general, planters and managers were reluctant to demote drivers because they knew all too well that punishing a big man was fraught with danger. As slave owner Thomas Ruffley cautioned in his Jamaica Planter's Guide, written in 1823, just 6 years earlier, it gives a great deal of vexation to an overseer when he changes his head driver. Caprice should never have any hand in such a transaction. So, drivers were typically demoted only when it became obvious to white plantation authorities that they were unable or unwilling to perform their basic duties, and especially when drivers were disruptive. There were many reasons white plantation authorities came to see drivers as ineffective, including excessive drinking that interfered with their work. The owner of a Trinidad sugar plantation decided to break or fire his driver for being a habitual drunk, even after he had been warned that he, as a driver, was setting a very bad example for the rest of the gang. For this driver, as for others, part of the problem with being drunk was that it lowered inhibitions and could lead to what enslavers saw as insolent outbursts. Greetings, Forecast. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. In this case, the driver was, in the owner's eyes, not only drunk, but excessively insolent. A driver on a different Trinidad plantation was similarly fired for what the manager saw as drunken insubordination. Ever since the manager had taken over the plantation, the driver had been very frequently intoxicated. Worse, from the manager's point of view, whenever the driver was drunk, he acted very violently. Even then, the manager hesitated to demote him, but reached his breaking point when he found the driver so drunk while supervising field laborers that he could not even keep his balance. Confronted by the manager, the driver hurled at him all the curses generally used by slaves and called him a damned infernal liar, a scoundrel, and a vagabond and a villain. Even more shockingly, the driver threatened to blackmail the manager. He said that if the manager punished him, he would go to the plantation owner and tell him about the tricks the manager was playing in order to have him discharged. Drivers could also be demoted for apparent negligence. In one case, from Berbice, a 40-year-old man named Jupiter, who had worked as a driver for at least 13 years, which was a long tenure, suggests that he maintained his enslaver's confidence, eventually gave the plantation manager the impression he was no longer cut out for the job. After a period of what the manager described as repeated neglect and evident incapability, the straw that broke the camel's back came one morning when Jupiter failed to get the people he supervised to their work early enough. In response, the manager flogged Jupiter, locked him in the plantation hospital, and ultimately broke him as a driver. Drivers who did not use as much violence as their enslavers expected against other enslaved people, or who were not exacting enough in supervising field work, could also find themselves demoted for being too soft. Such was the case with a demoted driver in Nevis who told magistrates that he and the manager never agreed together because the driver did not beat the Negroes for every fault. A female driver on a Jamaican sugar estate named Mary Tate was similarly fired from her office for what the plantation's attorney described as winking at the idleness of those under her charge and for not paying attention to the children and reporting dirt eaters to the supervisor and head man. In extraordinary cases, drivers themselves recognized that they were not capable of doing such a difficult, dangerous job and actually asked to be given a different one. A driver in Martinique named Césaire reportedly asked the owner of the sugar plantation where he worked to relieve him of his command, saying he was not well and did not feel talented enough to be a driver. The owner had not been displeased with him, but nevertheless accepted his resignation as driver of the gang and reassigned him to supervise work in the woods or in the sugar buildings. In Grenada, a head driver named Mitchell similarly admitted that he struggled to get the people he supervised to follow his orders. The underlying problem, as Mitchell's sister later admitted, was that his fellow slaves deeply disliked him and apparently did not respect him either. Mitchell tried to terrorize them into compliance, but that only promoted more defiance. People regularly complained to the manager that Mitchell was ill-treating them and deserted the plantation. The manager, who must have known that a widely unpopular driver was also likely to be counterproductive, granted Mitchell's request to be reassigned to his old role as a cooper. That Mitchell had an alternative field to field labor helps explain why he could welcome demotion. At the same time, Mitchell recognized that the way he had treated people while as a driver had damaged whatever standing in the community he may have had previously. "Don't you think," he asked his brother, "the Negroes hate me?" Mitchell's experience is a stark reminder that being able to command the respect of other slaves or being seen as a big man was an essential quality of a successful driver. Drivers who were openly insubordinate were also very likely to be demoted, as demonstrated by an incident involving a driver named Fielding on a large Berbice coffee plantation. After the manager ordered an enslaved woman to be confined in the black hole, Fielding released her so that she could seek the attorney's pardon. The enraged field manager confronted Fielding and ordered him to the stocks. Fielding denied having released her, resisted being put in the stocks, and became very violent. Fielding then appealed to the fiscal, claiming he had been punished unjustly, but the fiscal was characteristically unsympathetic. He agreed with the attorney that an exemplary punishment was necessary to quell the insubordinate conduct of this man to prevent others from following his evil and dangerous example. Fielding was taken back to the plantation, where he was flogged in front of the entire slave population, locked in the black hole for 4 weeks, and demoted as a driver. For white plantation authorities, even worse than such acts of insubordination were drivers who actively conspired with other people to sabotage plantation production, which was precisely the opposite of what they were expected to do. One driver on a Trinidad sugar plantation, for instance, was demoted when the manager concluded that the gang did not perform enough work. The underlying problem, however, was that the driver and the people under him were apparently colluding to reduce sugar production. The manager suspected that the reason output declined by 1/3 was that some understanding existed between the driver and the people. The wide range of ways that a determined driver could sabotage production and thus get himself demoted is illustrated by an especially well-documented case from Oranjestein, a sugar plantation with about 100 enslaved people on the Essequibo River in what is now Guyana. Over the course of several months in 1830, the plantation's head driver, Manuel, came under suspicion for actively working to undermine his owner's authority, disrupt production, and foment resistance. At one point, while his owner was ill and presumably unable to supervise Manuel closely, Manuel allowed his gang to idle for 2 weeks, getting only half as much work done as the owner thought they should have. Even worse, as Manuel's owner saw it, Manuel used his influence over the other slaves, which the owner admitted was more extensive than his own, to encourage disobedience of orders, deleteriousness of work, and to every other thing injurious and ruinous to the interest of the property. On one occasion, for example, Manuel conspired with the punt driver to retard the work and cause the gang to idle, for which the owner had him flogged. Manuel's most recent punishment, 30 lashes inflicted by the driver of a neighboring plantation, was for having allegedly allowed freshly cut cane to remain in the field so long that it soured before it could be milled. Manuel also found himself blamed for encouraging people to run away. His owner believed that every person who deserted, many of them without the smallest cause, had been instigated to it by Manuel, who also received and entertained them in his house at night. In addition, Manuel undermined his owner's efforts to track production. The owner had ordered Manuel hundreds of times to report on the day's work, as every other driver did, but Manuel refused, from insolence and determined disobedience. On the rare occasions Manuel did make his daily report, he told bare-faced falsehoods, exaggerating the amount of work done to protect himself and the people below him. For this deception, the owner had Manuel tied up to the rail of the stairs leading to the owner's house, trying to humiliate Manuel into compliance. By early October, Manuel knew he was poised to be demoted. As a man in his early 50s, he must have also known that demotion to field labor on a sugar estate was akin to a death sentence. So he decided to take a major risk and traveled nearly 20 miles to Georgetown, Demerara, where he appealed to the colony's protector of slaves. Manuel's gambit backfired. The witnesses he called upon to substantiate his claim of having been punished without cause instead supported his owner's narrative. Manuel was actively undermining his enslavers. So serious was the threat posed by Manuel's really ruinous conduct, his owner concluded, that he needed to not only demote him, but also remove him from the estate where his harmful influence was attended with such prejudicial effect. Compared to other demoted drivers, January was different. There is no indication he was unable or unwilling to get the people he supervised to do their work. Neither did his enslavers nor his fellow slaves describe him, during his long tenure as driver, as an alcoholic, insolent, or insubordinate, much less a saboteur. These differences and the unusual circumstances of his demotion would ultimately have important consequences for January, for the other enslaved people on his plantation, and especially for the white authorities who struggled to control him. January's demotion. January's demotion in June of 1819 stemmed from his efforts to address a mysterious and deadly epidemic that was wreaking havoc on plantation Deutichem. Desperate to find a solution to a problem no one else seemed able to solve, January turned to a practitioner of Obeah, the criminalized Afro-Caribbean spiritual practice. In doing so, he provoked a series of investigations, each of which produced a different record, by white authorities on and off the plantation who saw Obeah as a multi-pronged threat. Plantation managers thought Obeah was disruptive to plantation discipline and led to violent, sometimes fatal, power struggles. So as soon as Boaz heard that people on Deutichem had turned to Obeah, he initiated an investigation that implicated January. Colonial officials, meanwhile, were determined to uphold the legal prohibition on Obeah on the grounds that it promoted the total subversion of all subordination and ultimate destruction of the inhabitants of this colony, and prosecuted several people, including January, in the Court of Criminal Justice. And the Christian missionary John Ray, who saw Obeah as African superstition that stood in the way of his efforts to convert the enslaved, followed the investigation and trial closely, interviewing a key participant from jail before the trial and reporting what he heard in a long letter to the abolitionist William Wilberforce. Ironically, January turned to Obeah not to sabotage plantation production, but effectively to stabilize it by preserving the lives of the enslaved laborers who made it possible. Focusing on the events that resulted in January's unusual demotion deepens our understanding of the extent to which some drivers saw themselves and came to be seen by others as community leaders. January must have been well aware that the practice of Obeah was illegal. So, his decision to take this major risk of using it was a sign of the extraordinary lengths to which he went to look out for the welfare of the people below him, to be what they would have seen as a proper big man. Everyone was accustomed to sickness, suffering, and death in Berbice, which was, even by the horrific standards of Caribbean slave societies, especially deadly. But in the spring of 1819, things seemed worse than normal. Children in particular were getting sick and dying more often than before, and no one seemed to know why. White plantation authorities throughout the colony generally focused on the obvious symptoms of sickness when they paid attention at all, and subjected enslaved people to medical treatments that rarely made things better and often made them worse. Nothing white management did gave the enslaved people on Deutichem any confidence that they understood the underlying cause of the epidemic or had an effective plan to combat it. Eventually, many enslaved people began to suspect that the epidemic was the result of someone deliberately harming others with poison or obeah. If that was the case, the only solution was to find a spiritual healer who could discern the underlying problem and then solve it. This placed January in a difficult situation. Any divination or healing rituals would have to be performed clandestinely, and secrets were hard to keep on a plantation with more than 300 enslaved people. There were inherent risks to obeah rituals themselves, which were unpredictable and sometimes physically dangerous, and there was no guarantee that they would work. What's more, obeah was a capital crime, and pretty much anything January did to combat the epidemic on his own would look to the plantation's white employees like an affront to their authority, an implicit assertion that January knew how to run the plantation better than they did. Nevertheless, January ultimately decided that things were bad enough for him to risk going ahead with consulting an obeah practitioner. Fortunately, he knew of someone who might be able to help, a half-blind, enslaved Central African man named Hans. January knew that Hans had successfully solved similar problems on other plantations. In one case, Hans had stemmed the tide of miscarriages by treating pregnant women, and in another, he had identified the men behind 2 poisonings. When approached by January, Hans was reluctant to get involved. Only after January asked him 6 times did he agree to travel to Deutschem and help. In advance of Hans's arrival, late on a Saturday night of Saturday, June 12th, January organized the others. According to a woman named Venus, who would soon play a key role in the identification of the suspected poisoner, January ordered that nobody was to quit the estate. Everybody had to come to his house. When Hans arrived, January noticed that one man was conspicuously absent, the head carpenter, Frederick. January went to Frederick's house, woke him up, and told him to join the group. Once everyone had assembled, January initiated proceedings with an oath. He poured some rum into a ram's horn, took a drink, and announced that he wished to have the bad people off the estate, and that everybody had to listen well. He told them that Hans would help them put everything to rights. Hans began to sing his country song and conducted a series of rituals that lasted all night. Around sunrise, before everyone dispersed to complete their normal Sunday morning tasks, Hans announced that he would need to be paid for his services, as was customary with obeah practitioners. When they reconvened, as Hans put it, since he had come to set things right on the estate, everybody, big and little, had to contribute a bit or coin. Hans's payment sparked a revealing dispute about the power dynamics and complex hierarchies within the slave community, where drivers were not the only big men. January began taking up the collection, but Hans interrupted and told Frederick to do so instead. Greetings, KW Don 7. Thanks for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. You must collect this money, he ordered. Frederick objected on the grounds that January was the head driver and the one who had brought Hans to the plantation. Frederick, however, occupied an unusual position on the plantation, which may explain both why Hans considered him the head man of the estate and why Frederick was reluctant to get involved. Frederick was among the oldest and most materially well-off people in the Deutschem slave community. The previous owner had left him a monthly bequest of 1 Joe as a reward for his supposed loyalty. Frederick carefully saved his money and eventually accumulated enough to purchase his own slave. His age, which was about 46 years, and status as head carpenter also commanded respect, as some people knew him as Uncle Frederick. At the same time, some evidence suggests that other enslaved people were jealous of him. According to the missionary John Ray, long before the 1819 event, they had blamed Frederick as a poisoner. Despite his understandable reticence, Frederick ultimately agreed to collect the money for Hans. By about 11 a.m., Hans was ready to begin the next phase of his work, the Minje Mama dance. This collective divination ritual, with variations throughout the Black Atlantic world and performed in moments of crisis, would allow Hans to pull off all the poison that was in the ground. He sacrificed a chicken, placed its feathers in the children's hair, and washed everyone with a mix of water, grass, and wild canes. He then had everyone form a circle, singing, clapping, and dancing on one foot until several of them fell into a trance, possessed by spirits who might reveal the identity of the poisoner. Before long, Venus fell into an especially deep trance, burst into hysterical laughter, and denounced Frederick as the bad man on the estate. She ran out of the circle and said, "Come and I show you where the poison is hid," and led a large group to Frederick's house. Frederick, in a show of confidence that he was not the poisoner, allowed Venus and the others to ransack his house. They overturned water casks, broke apart the kitchen and fowl house. They even pulled up the floorboards to dig into the earth below, but the poison was nowhere to be found. Venus apparently panicked and said she had made a mistake, that she had meant to accuse another carpenter. She wanted to go back to Hans, who had stayed at January's to get her eyes properly washed. But Frederick insisted that they complete their search, presumably so he could be exonerated. When Venus and the others left to consult Hans, Frederick decided that enough was enough. Frederick went to the plantation's overseer Boaz. He in turn reported what he learned to the plantation's authority, who confronted January and the other drivers. January insisted he had done nothing wrong. He explained that they had asked Hans for help, that Hans was a good man, and that the only purpose for the Minji Mama dance was to find out the cause of these sudden deaths. In short, January asserted that he had done what was necessary to take care of his people. Greetings, Sister Ra, and the elders listening with you. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. But January's explanation fell on deaf ears. The attorney locked January and the other drivers in the stocks and alerted colonial officials so that the fiscal could initiate a formal investigation. Meanwhile, Hans was determined to finish his work. After evading capture by hiding out on the plantation, he resumed the divination process on Monday night. With a few other men, he returned to Frederick's house after dark to uncover the bad thing. Hans knew it was there from the smell he had of it, and after a complicated ritual, produced a pot of obeah. This, he said, was the bad thing which had destroyed the children, but it would do so no longer. The fiscal's investigation was quick and ruthless. Hans was apprehended, and he, Venus, and several others were convicted and given brutal sentences. January was singled out as especially culpable because he was a driver. According to the fiscal, the offense would be rightly censured and severely punished if committed by any individual, but it was far more deserving of the utmost rigor of the law when committed by the head driver of an estate in whom great trust and confidence was placed. January was sentenced to a series of painful, humiliating punishments. He was publicly flogged under the gallows and branded. Then he was taken back to the plantation where he was forced to work with heavy chain locked to his leg for the next year. Of course, January also lost his position as head driver and was demoted to the status of an ordinary laborer. The events that culminated in January's demotion ultimately led enslavers and enslaved laborers to see him in contradictory ways. While no one doubted the extent of January's authority, whites saw him as a man who had abused that authority to induce others to participate in a criminal conspiracy. He was therefore, in their eyes, guilty of the most egregious abuse of power, the epitome of a driver who had betrayed their trust. In contrast, other enslaved people likely saw January as the exact opposite, a courageous leader, a true big man who had taken great risks to heal and protect them when no one else would. For them, January was anything but a bad driver. What's more, the authority that he earned by sticking his neck out for others would turn out to be remarkably enduring. Even the plantation's owner, who described January some 10 years later as a disgraced driver, recognized that January still held an unbounded authority over the gang of slaves. In retrospect, everyone could see that the unusual circumstances surrounding January's demotion had sown the seeds of conflict that would erupt a decade later. Blowback. For a time after his demotion, January took out his anger through small acts of retribution. As Boaz put it, January conducted himself whenever an opportunity occurred of treating me with the utmost disrespect. The many instances of January's disrespectful conduct included deliberate efforts to undermine Boaz's authority. When January addressed Boaz, he made a point of dropping the mister. He also directed others to follow suit. As Boaz learned from one of the current drivers, January told others not to call him Mr., but plainly Boaz. With the political skill that characterized the most adept drivers, January managed to make his bitter grudge against Boaz clear without going far enough to provoke white plantation authorities to punish him. He may well have guessed that Boaz felt pressure to overlook his behavior out of a sense that cracking down on a widely respected big man would backfire. For most other drivers who lost their position, the consequences of demotion were quite different. To be sure, like January, they often found demotion devastating. It came with a series of social and material losses. No longer would they enjoy the status that came with the position of driver or the special access they had previously received to scarce material resources like food and clothing. For most, demotion also meant the end of being exempted from exhausting, dangerous field work. But many demoted drivers, unlike January, lacked strong enough social connections within the slave community to mobilize followers, and thus had little effective recourse. Such demoted drivers, no matter how embittered, posed little permanent threat to the plantation regime. Exploring the various ways that demoted drivers reacted, nevertheless, reveals both the deep investment drivers had in their position and the wider consequences of demotion, not only for drivers themselves, but also for other people on the plantations where they lived. For some drivers, the humiliation of losing their position provoked intense despair. According to the son of one planter, being cast out of that favored circle was a disgrace almost more to be dreaded than death. Some demoted drivers, in fact, saw no alternative other than suicide. When Philip, an African man on a Berbice sugar plantation who worked as a driver to the Creoles or children, was demoted, he was hopeless. As his wife put it, his heart was turned. Philip was, she clarified, ashamed of being put into the field after so long being a headman. The day after the manager demoted him for chronic drunkenness and negligence, and then humiliated him with a public flogging, Philip ran to the Kanji River and bordered the plantation. When he jumped in, the overseer feared Philip was trying to escape and sent others to capture him. But Philip had other plans. Soon, he was too far away, and before they could reach him, he disappeared and drowned himself, leaving behind a wife and several young children. Philip may have been driven to suicide out of a sense that as an ordinary laborer rather than a big man, he would find it impossible to protect and provide for his family in the way he had hoped. The emotional unraveling of another demoted driver named Joseph was documented by Moravian missionaries on plantation Mesopotamia in Jamaica. By the late 1770s, Joseph had been a driver for at least 2 decades, and for several years had been the head driver. Like Matthew, whose experience is recounted in the previous chapter, Joseph became one of Moravians' earliest converts and a leader in their spiritual community. In 1778, he came into conflict with a new overseer. As the sympathetic missionaries noted, the overseer was very sharp and wanted Joseph to whip the Negroes more than he liked, and more than he could for conscience sake. A year later, Joseph was put down from head driver to second driver. Soon thereafter, he lost his position as a driver entirely and was put to rat catching. For being an ineffective rat catcher, he got severe punishment, which he took too much to heart. After his being a big man for decades, these humiliations were too much to bear. Joseph began drinking heavily and struggled with his Christian faith. The missionaries lamented that he almost lost his confidence in our Savior, and he even showed up drunk to a burial service. Joseph was the missionaries observed, cast down with grief and seemingly heartbroken over his hard treatment. A short time later, he died. Other drivers tried to leverage personal relationships with white people in positions of power to protest their demotion or regain their position. One such case involved an enslaved woman named Asia, who worked as a driver of the Feeble Gang on a large Demerara plantation for some 30 years until the manager demoted her around May of 1821. By October, Asia's predicament was dire. In her mid-50s, she was unable to endure the rigors of field labor, and after just a few weeks, she fell ill. According to missionary John Smith, who lived on the same plantation as Asia, Asia told the manager her strength was not equal to the work and she could not do it. He responded by locking her in the stocks on and off for several months. One afternoon, after the manager used her very ill by kicking and thumping her, Asia appealed to Smith's wife, asking her to use some means to endeavor to get her out of the stocks and presumably get her position back. Mrs. Smith recognized that field work was doubtless too laborious for such an old woman and told the manager if he intended to continue such severe treatment to the old woman, she would appeal to the plantation's attorney. When the manager responded that he intended to lock Asia in the stocks until she would promise to work in the field as he demanded, Mrs. Smith made good on her threat and wrote to the attorney. Several days later, when he visited the plantation, he instructed that Asia be released from the stocks and after regaining her strength, be given some light work. There is no indication, however, that she ever regained her position as driver. A case from a more remote plantation on the upper Berbice River illustrates how drivers sometimes appealed to colonial authorities in the wake of their demotions. Willem was a driver who experienced a change of fortune over the course of several years. At least some of the other enslaved people on the plantation thought he was harsh and callous, as evidenced by a complaint from one man who told the fiscal that Willem was so severe that the people were scarcely able to keep it out with him. Willem often told them he did not care whether the people hanged or drowned themselves or whether they ran away in the bush. Willem's manager, however, considered him an effective driver, perhaps precisely because he was so severe, and even described him as a great favorite. Over time, however, the manager soured on Willem, beginning with a drowning accident that claimed the lives of 3 of the best people on the plantation, which the manager blamed on Willem. Things really took a turn for the worse when Willem went to the fiscal, presumably to complain against the manager. Though his complaint was not recorded, only to be dismissed and then exemplarily punished. As a result, Willem retaliated against the manager. He allegedly neglected his own work and encouraged other enslaved people to do the same. He also became distressed that the manager no longer called him a favorite, but said he considered him worthless, good for nothing, and a bad Negro. The manager concluded that Willem is endeavoring to ruin him so he broke or demoted Willem. Finding it impossible to agree with his manager and the other enslaved people on the plantation in the wake of his demotion, Willem appealed to the fiscal. He did not complain that his manager had broken the law or otherwise abused him. Willem ultimately admitted that his only cause of complaint was a desire to be sold or hired out because his master no longer liked him. His situation was so bad that he would rather work in chains than on his master's place. For Willem, appealing to the fiscal only made things worse. The fiscal said nothing about the emotional dynamics in the case, ignoring William's despair. More relevant to the fiscal was that he had no authority to compel a proprietor to dispose of, that is, to sell, a slave, merely to satisfy the wish of such a slave. Moreover, Willem had broken the implicit rules that governed relationships between enslaved people and their enslavers. Willem's master was bound to treat him with kindness and care, and supply him with plenty of good food and necessary comforts. Willem, in return, was bound to perform his duty diligently and faithfully. Instead, Willem's conduct, both as a driver and afterwards, was very reprehensible. So too was the act of making a supposedly groundless complaint that deprived the enslaver of much time and labor. The fiscal ordered Willem to be given 48 lashes and then sent back to the plantation, where Willem continued to face the humiliation of working alongside those he had formerly supervised and the risks that came with working under a manager who hated him. Other demoted drivers who went to colonial authorities recognized that they had virtually no chance of regaining their position, no matter what they did, and instead seemed to have been motivated by a desire to get some sort of retribution against their enslavers. In such cases, demoted drivers did not complain about demotion per se or ask to be reinstated, but instead alleged that their enslavers had broken the law. Take, for instance, the complaint of a man named Gabriel, who lost his position as chief driver on a St. Lucian sugar plantation. After his demotion, Gabriel joined another enslaved man in making a complaint against the manager. Gabriel told the protector of slaves that the manager had taken away the command from him, but he also alleged that the manager subjected him to an excessive, potentially illegal punishment. He had been confined in the cachot, or black hole, from Saturday afternoon until Tuesday morning, and during his confinement was not provided with sufficient food. Gabriel also alleged that he had not received the required weekly allowance of salt meat, but only 1.5 pounds. The protector ignored the issue of Gabriel's demotion, which was not his prerogative, and focused on the details of his punishment. The manager and other witnesses said that Gabriel lied about receiving enough food, and Gabriel eventually admitted that he had refused the food offered because he had food of his own. The manager also explained that Gabriel had been deprived of his command for doing his work poorly and for being impertinent to him, especially when he sent a chair to the field so that Gabriel might be more at his ease. The protector dismissed Gabriel's complaint and sentenced him to an additional punishment, 30 lashes and an entire month of confinement. For white plantation authorities, firing ineffective drivers without broad support from below was, most of the time, only temporarily disruptive. Even when such demoted drivers were bold enough to protest their demotion or retaliate, their resistance usually could be thwarted. In time, they might even learn to live with their new role, calculating the risks of continued defiance were too great. January's experience once again stands out. His decade-long antagonism toward Boaz made clear the wound inflicted in 1819 had never healed. Everyone, including Boaz, knew that January continued to see him as the cause of his being flogged under the gallows and then demoted, and that January was determined to get his revenge by getting Boaz fired or worse. But it was not until 1829 that things reached a boiling point. January grew bolder in his opposition to Boaz in the days ahead of the new owner's arrival. One night, when he was quite drunk and his inhibitions were lowered, January went so far as to taunt Boaz at his own house. January told Boaz that he was not cunning enough for him. Then he made the most thinly veiled of threats, pointing to the burial ground. He asked Boaz whether he didn't think he would be laid there. Turning to the two other white plantation employees who were with Boaz, January answered his own question. Yes, he said, that is where Boaz will go. Crisis. When the large group of enslaved people on Plantation Deutschem assembled at the house of the newly arrived owner, Thomas Winter, that Sunday morning in March of 1829, Winter was probably the only one who failed to realize that the roots of the ensuing confrontation between Boaz and January stretched back a decade. Speaking English rather than Creole so that Winter could understand, Boaz accused January of having organized the gathering for nefarious purposes. Boaz replied that his involvement was benign. He told Boaz that he was not the instigator but the last one to join the group, that they had only gone for the rum, and that there was no harm in having done so. Boaz continued to insist that January was trying to undermine his authority. As tempers flared, Boaz and January switched back into Creole, and it became clear that Boaz was right to expect the worst. At one point, January explicitly challenged Boaz's authority. "Isn't Winter," he asked, "our actual master?" Boaz weakly retorted that January was a rascal and tried to shut him up. Instead, January pressed the issue. He asked Boaz, "Do I belong to you? Is the rum yours? Or are you able to buy me?" In front of Winter and everyone else, January continued to make other comments that Boaz knew were intended, of course, to lessen him in their opinion. For Boaz, things went from bad to worse when he ordered the current drivers to take January to the hospital and confine him to the stocks. January refused to leave. He would not go. He insisted. No man, he added, would hurt him. And when the drivers tried to drag him away from Winter's house, he began to fight. Boaz panicked, determined to assert his power. He insisted he would do whatever it took to get January under control. If you will not go with 2 men, Boaz told him, I will put 4. And if they are not sufficient, I will put 6. For you must and shall go to confinement. Winter, shocked by such blatant defiance, and no doubt concerned by his manager's inability to restore order, decided to intervene himself. Take that man away, he ordered the drivers. But Winter and Boaz would soon realize that no matter how much of a threat January's resistance posed, their problem was much bigger. January, unlike many demoted drivers, had clearly succeeded in attracting followers during his tenure as driver, and remarkably maintained many of them for some 10 years after his demotion. To be sure, his enslavers had stripped him of his official title and rank, or his ascribed status, but they could not take away his achieved status. There is no evidence that they succeeded in getting anyone to see January as they did, as a disgraced driver. Instead, January was a big man who could call upon his many supporters to help him strike back at the people he blamed for his downfall, with explosive consequences for the white plantation regime. A series of conflicts in 1832 on a sugar plantation in Trinidad illustrates just how much trouble a demoted driver with allies or followers willing to take up his fight would cause. Goyo had an especially difficult job as a driver because he worked for a particularly brutal manager named Thomas Fletcher, who routinely violated customary and statutory rules about labor and punishment. During crop season, everyone Goyo supervised had to wake up as early as first cock crow and begin work before sunrise. They were not allowed breaks to eat and sometimes had to work until 10 p.m. They also had no time to cultivate their provision grounds, which had been overtaken by bush, and were often forced to work on Sundays. Fletcher, who actually thought they were not working hard enough, who was always beating and ill-treating them, faced with such desperate situations, Goyo eventually decided to help the people he supervised make their work less onerous. Predictably, white authorities on the estate noticed that Goyo was not driving the gang hard enough, or as the overseer put it, that instead of forwarding their work, Goyo did everything to prevent them from pushing on. For instance, Goyo often told the able people not to go before the weak ones in order to set a slower collective pace of labor. When Goyo was demoted, he responded by redoubling his efforts to sabotage production. The overseer concluded, there is a combination against Mr. Fletcher instigated by Goyo, more particularly since he has been broke from being the driver. Having stood up for the people below him, Goyo continued to work to enjoy widespread support among the plantation's slave community. If anything, his demotion only drew him closer and the other enslaved people on the estate closer together in the campaign of resistance, which became obvious in late April when 10 people, which was nearly a fifth of the populations of the plantation's enslaved population, made a joint complaint to the protector of slaves. Among the complainants were apparently instigated were Goyo, Goyo's wife, his nephew, and his sister. In early May, Goyo himself left the plantation, and traveled to the protector's office to support the complainants. Goyo and the others alleged that Fletcher had committed several acts of egregious and illegal abuse. Goyo did not mention his demotion, but it was clear he had a personal stake in seeing Fletcher punished. He told the protector that Fletcher had once again beaten 3 women, including his wife, with a stick. Goyo must have known that by 1832 it was no longer legal to flog or beat enslaved women in Trinidad, and that such an offense could get the manager into trouble. The protector found the charges, especially the beating of 3 women, as well as an incident one night in which Fletcher allegedly broke the current driver's nose with the butt of a pistol, serious enough to forward the complaints to the Attorney General. Fletcher avoided criminal charges due to a supposed lack of evidence, but the collective complaint shows that a demoted driver who could mobilize support from kin and community had the potential to cause major problems for white plantation authorities. Additional evidence from other slave societies confirms that popular ex-drivers could rally support from their fellow slaves and even encourage them to commit bold acts of violent retribution. One day, on a sugar plantation in the Danish colony of St. Croix, some 30 enslaved people responded to the demotion of a driver by deserting and that night setting the cane fields on fire. On a Cuban sugar plantation, the demotion of a driver for supposedly disrespecting the manager led to a violent confrontation with plantation officials and the newly appointed driver. Having been forced to gather to witness their former driver, Jose, being punished with 25 lashes and then locked to a ball and chain, the other enslaved people on the plantation protested by striking. Desperate to reestablish control, the manager handed the whip to the new driver, Cristobal Caraballi, and ordered him to terrorize the others into submission. Cristobal tried, but wound up provoking fiercer resistance still from people who refused to respect his authority. They began taunting him, asking sarcastically, "Are you perchance our new manager?" And by the time he had cracked the whip 3 or 4 times, according to one witness, the slaves began stoning Cristobal, who had to run for his life. Among the most formidable allies some demoted drivers had were their wives. These women were deeply invested in their husband's status and were sometimes willing to use their own considerable authority to fight back. One demoted driver's wife, named Caroline, organized a tenacious campaign of resistance on a Berbice plantation in 1830. When the plantation was reorganized under a new manager, Caroline's husband, a 49-year-old African-born man, lost his position as driver. In response, Caroline collaborated with other women to sabotage production. This became obvious to the manager one day when he found 2 women doing the work of one and tried to modify working arrangements, which prompted Caroline to declare that the task was too great and then refused to do anything at all. Faced with such open defiance, the manager called Carolyn a dumbass bitch. Even then, Caroline refused to back down. Instead, she escalated the conflict by looking the manager in the eye, which provoked him to threaten to confine her and cool her. What, Caroline challenged, are people not to look anymore? The manager ultimately had her locked in the dark house and later the public stocks. Caroline appealed to the protector, adamant that she had been punished without cause. As the manager saw it, the problem was not simply Caroline's defiance, but her role in organizing a combination among the gang not to finish their work. Even after the protector dismissed Caroline's complaint, the manager found that confining the greater part of them in the public stocks night after night had not broken Caroline's determination. Instead, Caroline continued to instigate others to challenge the manager's authority, as shown by a second complaint to the protector just 6 days later. This time, 15 women and girls, including Caroline's 10-year-old daughter, asked the protector to intervene. Alarmed by such a large group and by multiple complaints from the same plantation in the space of a week, the protector went to the plantation to investigate. There, the manager insisted that there was a conspiracy among the women not to finish their work. The overseer concurred that Caroline had been the instigator of the rest. Just a year later, in the same colony, the reorganization of another plantation under new owners led to a similar conflict when the common-law husband of a woman named Berenger was demoted from his position as driver. Berenger declared war on the plantation's white management. In the wake of her husband's demotion, according to one of the new owners, Berenger was disaffected to all order and propriety, openly declaring lately in the field that she would not work well nor finish the task given her unless the manager was removed, and that she would not be quiet or obedient. Simmering tensions exploded one day in early 1831 when the owner decided to crack down on the customary practice of walking at night or leaving the plantation to visit friends and family. Berenger had been purchased a few years earlier from a Dutch estate where the owner knew enslaved people were much given to this custom. But he was determined to put an end to it. He repeatedly warned everyone not to leave. So when Berenger and her husband left the plantation one night, they wound up in serious trouble. The current drivers reported her and several others who had gone walking, and when they returned, locked them all up. After several hours, the owner released them with what he described as a gentle rebuke, as well as a threat that future transgressions would be severely punished. Everyone departed thankfully, except for Berenger. Infuriated that she had been ratted out, Berenger immediately turned upon and began to abuse the drivers. Berenger's defiance ultimately forced the owner to recognize that he was losing control of his enslaved labor force, and all because he could not control one enslaved woman. In an extraordinary move that must have been humiliating, he went to the fiscal to plead for help. The most recent confrontation, he emphasized, was part of a larger and more disturbing pattern. At root, his problem was, he said, that Berenger had acquired such an ascendancy over the other women that they do not finish a very reasonable task of work through fear of this woman. So he asked the fiscal to punish her in order to preserve some share of discipline and prevent this woman from breaking through all restraint. Women like Berenger and Caroline were evidently powerful authority figures in their own right who could draw upon their own social connections to wreak havoc on the plantation regime when their husbands were demoted. These were exactly the kind of crises that January threatened to provoke on Plantation Deutschen, when, in front of the entire gang, Boaz ordered the drivers to seize January and lock him up. The plantation dissolved into chaos. According to Boaz, the moment the drivers managed to drag January away, everyone erupted in protest. The whole gang told Boaz that if he was going to lock January up, he would have to lock all of them up. Boaz told them that the hospital would not hold them all, but if they insisted, he would confine as many as the hospital will contain. No, they responded, January must be released. Even though Winter was a newcomer, he tried to use his authority as the plantation's owner to reason with the people. You begged for a dram, he said, and it has been given to you. The man January has behaved ill and is punished. What have you to do with that? Go home quietly. But they refused to disperse. For more than 2 hours, they continued to protest, which was a remarkable demonstration of just how far they were willing to go to stand up for a man they continued to recognize as their leader. Seeing that Winter was getting nowhere and anxious to demonstrate his managerial competence, Boaz suggested that Winter had to be a good deal fatigued and might want to return to his house and repose to the sofa. Winter retreated, but everyone followed him into the house. It was an egregious disregard of the owner's status and a courageous show of solidarity. Once inside, they continued to insist that January had to be released and that Boaz had no right to confine him. Winter told them that he had authorized January's confinement as if they cared. As Boaz saw it, the world had turned upside down. Everyone was disobeying him in Winter, and even the drivers concluded that they could do nothing and went away to their houses. Boaz ordered the drivers back, stressing that Winter was very much dissatisfied with their conduct and insisted he would not be forced to release January. Finally, after hours of turmoil, the drivers and a few well-disposed slaves managed to get January's followers to disperse. Even then, the crisis of authority on the plantation was far from over. While Boaz left to get help from a civil magistrate, 2 of January's supporters tried to appeal to the white authorities on neighboring plantations. The plantation's owner saw them come over running like madmen, but when he learned what they wanted, he laughed at them and sent them back with a letter for Winter. At this point, January's defiance and his widespread support was undermining whatever confidence Winter had in Boaz's capacity to manage the plantation. Confronting Boaz, Winter demanded to know what Boaz had done to prompt this latest act of resistance. Boaz essentially threw up his hands. "You have seen what has occurred today," he replied. He did, however, promise to deal with the two troublemakers in the morning. Boaz's interrogation of the two men the next morning revealed just how much discord January had sown. Strategically, one of the men apologized and said he had only gone to complain because one of the drivers had put him up to it. The other man remained defiant. He admitted that their goal was the same as January's, to get rid of Boaz. He pointed out that longtime attorney who had planned to transfer January to another plantation had already left. So now he told Boaz he had to go also. When Boaz threatened to lock him up, he pointed to his throat and said, "You may cut this, but you shall not confine me." He also issued a threat, "I will plague you till you are forced to leave the estate." Boaz's efforts to punish January and his followers had indeed jeopardized his own position on the plantation. In an attempt to salvage whatever he was left of his reputation, Boaz asked the civil magistrate that he had summoned for help to write down the old story of Hans, the Minje Mama dance, and January's demotion 10 years earlier. To keep his position, Boaz needed to make it clear that the problems were not his incompetent management, but January's influence and the uprising he had sparked. Boaz suggested to Winter that there was a permanent solution to their problem. January could be removed from the plantation entirely. Winter agreed, as he later told the fiscal. It was critically important to remove the slave who possessed such unbounded authority over the others. For several days, January languished as a prisoner on Deutichem, alternating between fits of rage and last-ditch efforts to change his fate. At one point, when his wife brought him something to eat, he took it and dashed it away. Repeatedly, he asked Boaz if they were really going to send him to a plantation on the remote Quarantine Coast, which is on the colony's border with Suriname, and as if he did not know why he was to suffer such a punishment. For January, being uprooted from his community was understandably terrifying. He was close to 50 years old and had lived on Deutichem for many years, perhaps most of his life. Over the course of years, perhaps decades, he had cultivated relationships there and earned a reputation as a big man. It must have been horrifying to imagine having to start all over on a plantation where he would be an outsider and utterly alone. Even his wife refused to go with him. Leaving Deutichem thus brought January face to face with the threat of social death. Boaz taunted January, telling him that he had already been symbolically erased. "I have," he said, "taken your name off of the list as being attached to Deutichem." In desperation, January made a fruitless appeal to Winter and then asked Boaz for a pass so that he could go downriver to see the fiscal in New Amsterdam, the colony's capital. Unsurprisingly, Boaz refused and ordered January to board the schooner that would take him to Quarantine Coast. When the schooner passed through New Amsterdam, January, in a final act of defiance, fled and made his way to the fiscal's office. Even though January did not have a pass, the fiscal heard his lengthy complaint and committed some version of his story to written record. The fiscal then summoned Boaz Winter and other witnesses who gave their own detailed accounts of what they had seen, heard, and done. Like almost all aggrieved drivers who appealed to colonial authorities, January did not get what he wanted. The fiscal refused to intervene and sentenced January to 15 lashes. The problem of January's unbounded authority exposes a tension at the heart of the driving system. White plantation authorities relied on strong drivers to run their plantations and keep them safe. They knew that to get other enslaved laborers to follow orders, drivers had to project authority and command respect. That was why they appointed people to the position of driver who were already recognized as leaders, and why they went to great lengths to make everyone treat drivers as authority figures. When planters or plantation managers concluded that drivers were ineffective, disruptive, however, they did not hesitate to demote them. Demoted drivers found their loss of status and related material advantages devastating, but they often lacked the political capital to mount effective resistance. If anything, the feeble and counterproductive ways in which some demoted drivers lashed out essentially confirmed that they were not capable leaders. Ironically, the demoted drivers who posed the greatest threat to white plantation authorities were those who had become too powerful. Such drivers had succeeded all too well in one of the drivers' primary goals, earning the respect of other enslaved people and convincing them of their authority. When drivers like January, who had established themselves as strong leaders far beyond the scope of their official role and consequently commanded fierce loyalty, were demoted, they could not be easily controlled. Instead, such drivers could draw on their strong social ties to mobilize allies against the plantation regime they had once made function. Sometimes, drivers conspired to overthrow their enslavers entirely. And that is the end of chapter 4. So, as you can see, drivers were in a very precarious situation. They had this level of authority, this level of power and control, this level of responsibility and respect on the plantation. But at the same time, it was totally arbitrary and subject to the whim and will of the white managers, owners, and overseers. Additionally, going to the fiscal often did not solve their problems. Going to the fiscal usually made their problems worse. And women were often the ones standing up for the man to try to keep his job as a driver because she was going to lose all of the resources that she had access to through him. And as you can see, there were a lot of contentious relationships that ensued because of this driver breaking process when a driver was demoted. So, when a driver was demoted, there's often this responsibility of the new driver to assert their dominance and show their power, control, and respect. And they have to assert their dominance and win over the people, but that process took time. And in January's case, The new driver, Boaz, almost never got the full support of all the people. He got partial support and partial buy in. The forecast says it's always been a way to drive division among us. Yes, it is always a way to drive division among us because we want to be together. Our natural way of being is to be together and to be united. And so the only way that they can assert their power, control, dominance, and authority in any way, shape, form, or fashion in this area of the world is to drive a wedge between us. And that wedge is often the role and responsibility of the driver. You know, they give one black man a whip and tell him he has the authority, divine authority imbued by God himself to whip the rest of the Negroes into shape to do the will of the master and the attorney and the owner. And of course, that goes to his head. And of course, he feels like he's going to drive them for the sake of driving them. Of course, he's going to drive these Negroes to the end. Like the one driver who didn't have any care or respect for whether or not you would run off or you died or he whipped you to death. He didn't care. He didn't care whether or not He didn't care whether or not you wanted to run away or whether or not you wanted to stay on the plantation or whether or not you went to the fiscal. He didn't care. He just wanted to beat you, to show his authority and assert his dominance and control, as forecast says, to feel powerful. And he wanted to get the will of the master done because he didn't want to lose his position. He didn't want to lose out on what he had access to. He didn't want to lose his meager possessions. But this is the role of the driver. And in modern society, the driver is a middle manager. I'm just telling you, this is just what it is. Middle management will beat up on the laborers in an employment situation, will make their lives hell in an attempt to hold on to the few possessions that they have, not realizing they're in a precarious position where the things that have been given to them by upper management and executives can be taken away at any point in time. The forecast says they think they are validated, not knowing you are the tool of your own enslavement. Exactly. You are the tool of your own enslavement. Ultimately, you are the one that is responsible for continuing the slave system. Drivers were the neck that turned the head and guided the body and connected the body of the entire enslavement system. Because without drivers, it never would have worked. So without terrorizing and exploiting these people to think that they have some level of control and can get some additional benefits and privileges, the slave system never would have worked. So what do you guys think? Do you think that employment is slavery? Do you think that the way that we go about going to our jobs, listening to our bosses, doing what they say and not petitioning for better conditions and joining together and demanding shorter work weeks and demanding higher wages, do you think that employment is slavery? I think that employment is slavery. I'm not saying that you have to go out there and quit your job today, but I think you should go out there and you should make a plan for what you're going to do when that job no longer exists, because they are doing everything they can to make every type of job, with the exception of skilled labor, obsolete. They've already replaced customer service representatives with AI. I called my doctor's office today, and they have an AI named Claude that took my appointment details and information. I used to be able to talk to a person. So I guess that they are continuing to implement these systems. It is employment is slavery. Some slaves even got paid money. Yes, they did. Greetings, forecast. How are you this evening?
Hey, how you doing, Matron?
I'm good.
Yeah, it was a great reading, like always. And you be picking some interesting books. Oh yeah, and by the way, it's like AI. Like I went to a place that was like a drive-through for like my parents, and like the drive-through was AI. Like it was a machine. Like it was. I ain't never seen that before.
I'm telling AI is taking over all the jobs. They say that they even have an AI restaurant in California where the workers are AI. They have machines that make the food, that take the orders, that place the food, that take and process the orders. So AI is taking over all of the low wage entry level jobs. So unless you are highly skilled labor or technically trained, you're not going to have a job.
Yeah, correct. And like you were saying, that's why you should probably find a field or some kind of area to where you can create your own or come up with some kind of product or service or something that people need so that you can take advantage of whatever or even programming, because that's one of the important things as far as black people getting into. I talked about it a while ago, like black people doing the whole STEM thing, or even web design, or just different things like that. You know what I'm saying? So all those
Yeah,
is important.
absolutely. I absolutely agree. And right now, you can get into into a job where you're training and modeling the AI, where you are an AI programmer, so that you are able to help control and guide where the technology is going.
Yeah, yeah. And I really hopped on is to answer your question about it, uh is your job slavery, you know. And look, and I'm not saying like trying to, because of course, like I have to go to, I'm a slave right now, you know what I'm saying? So, but the point is, like, you use all of these, like, you're supposed to use whatever you can, you know what I'm saying? Even if you can get food stamps or whatever it is, I think that you should take every single advantage that you possibly can, you know? But I don't think we actually understand the context of like, you were one of the few people that pointed that I heard point out, say, as far as the 13th Amendment, it says involuntary servitude. You know that part. Everybody know about, except if you commit a crime, but nobody really talks about the voluntary servitude. And it kind of pisses me off because, like, you know, Mexicans get the rep of they work so hard, but one person was like, it's not that they work hard, it's that they work cheaper, you know. But it like drives me crazy because if you ever worked around them, like, they're so lazy, but it's the old black men that step up, and I'm like, yo, what the hell? Like, are they, you must got stock in the company or something, which they do not, right? And what we don't understand is controlling means of production, you know, as far as, not, we don't own anything, you know. We are workers. Like, we don't have water companies, you know, we can't get our water turned on by a black company, things like that. You know, we got, you know, some basic stuff, and we improving a lot, but I don't think we understand the context of even having to go to sleep early the day before, right? You, like, just all of that kind of stuff, instead of taking the time to do the stuff that you need to do. And then your jobs give you sleep deprivation, you're tired, and they just giving you just enough to come back. But for some reason, we not angry about that. Like, and that's what always kind of confused me. And then they take our tax money after all of that and then say we owe you for like property tax. Like, I owe you more tax money on something that I already own. Like, but I didn't mean to go on that rant like that.
You're okay. And I completely understand where you're coming from because the reality of the situation is that there was this statement made back in the 80s that said, you will own nothing and be happy, which means and we live that life right now, which is a subscription service based life. It started with our taxes and our televisions, but now features and cars are subscription service based. And some of the newer cars, where if you don't pay for the subscription upgrade to have a certain feature in your car, it's there, but you don't have access to it because you're not paying the fee for it. Additionally, we're not mad because we're too tired and have been too conditioned that everything has to be paid for and that everything has to be hard. And so we don't think about things in that way. The reason that a Mexican can work for so much less money is because they have a whole nother country they can send their money to, and their money can be made into more money there than it is here. So they can work for $10 or $15 an hour because they're not in an environment. They can go to an environment where $10 or $15 an hour turns into $50 an hour because they have a whole nother country they can go to. We don't have that benefit, and we should be angrier and we should be more unified and we should, but woulda, shoulda, coulda. But we should be more upset about these different things. We're not because they keep us so busy in the rat race of trying to keep up with what we need to buy and on this path of consumer that we don't often take the time to stick our heads up and look around. One of the reasons I think that they got rid of Spirit Airlines is because we were traveling too much and we were beginning to see that other countries don't live in the constant grind that we live in. And because we were able to see that, hey, it doesn't have to be this constant grind, a couple of $100 a month should be able to buy groceries. In an economy as big as ours, there should be a more equitable division of wealth. In a world where we have bought and paid for a house and paid taxes on it for 30 years, we shouldn't have to pay more taxes on that property. So I think that one of the reasons that they're getting rid of all these lower cost airlines is because they don't want us traveling to all these other places to see that it doesn't have to be this hard. It doesn't have to be this complicated.
No, yeah, that's true. And one of the things, the internet has changed the game to a certain degree, which is probably why they have limitations. But even these platforms, we don't necessarily own. And even I don't know if you've been on like some of the black platforms, but for one, they don't hold the same kind of data. But also, sometimes it get kind of crazy on there.
Hmm.
But no, yeah, it's like you were saying, like as far as like because I had somebody tell me, well, yeah, back when Obama, like, rent was much cheaper. But yeah, people were making much less money. We looking at it differently from the percentages and all of that stuff. But like and that's why as far as black people like owning properties and stuff like that, making money without like residual cash, you know what I'm saying? Or creating something or using your expertise at something to create something that is like a side like so you're not always dependent because I remember when my job like and this is for each his own or whatever, but I still feel like it's wrong to force somebody to get like the jab or whatever. But like my job was like, well, if you don't get the jab by this date, then you're fired. And I seen some brothers who did not want to do it and all of that stuff, but they was like, well, I don't want to lose my job. But like, bro, you making like the most what $20 an hour? You know what I'm saying? And even in my last place that I was at, it was a regular place, and this was like rent was like here is like 750, but now it's like double, it's like 1400 for the same size apartment. But I noticed this like I wasn't even making that much money at the time, and they was like, well, you still make too much to live in this place, but the rent was still $1,000, so they need you to have to at least spend one third of your income on on your apartment, you know. And that doesn't count all of the other things, all the other bills that go along with it, the light bill, all of that stuff. Like they need to have you in a broke position, or else you ain't even gonna go to their jobs. You know what I mean? So yeah, I don't.
Yeah.
It's mm,
Yeah, I absolutely agree. They need to keep you in survival mode, because at the point that you're not in survival mode, you begin to see the all of the injustices that are meted out in the society. They need to keep you in survival mode, and they need to keep you under privileged, and they don't need to make it equitable for you to live in this society, because at the point that they make it equal, they know that they lose all of their advantages.
right, and that's what I be trying to tell people when I be like, because I don't care about any one of them individually. It's a system, and why would I give up a system there that is there to protect me? Now, don't get me wrong, like they do to the dumb poor whites the same thing, you know, as what the Democrats would do, but what they use the poor whites just the same way, you know. I understand that, but this is not my problem that they're too dumb to understand that, you know. But they like the system, they're never going to give up that power. And black people just think like, oh well, you know, if we do this, if we reason here, if we fight this and do that, nobody who controls the water supply, the food supply, or whatever, and they make all of the rules and decisions, because that's what politicians go by. They all getting paid by like corporations, and that's who they're actually going to pass laws for. And you're probably never going to hear about the laws that pass. But like even with these healthcare companies, like you can't force me to go to a certain healthcare company and force me to pay, and they can charge you whatever they want. You know what I'm saying? If that's the case, well, you're supposed to give us the self-care for free, but they're not going to do that, you know, because the point is for you to be sick and for you to be struggling and for you to be like, well, yeah, I would be willing to take this jab, you know, for this $20 an hour that I'll die still making money when I'm, in my case, probably 70 or 75 or something by the time, if there's any social security left. But like even now, it's like older brothers I know, 68, 69, still working in hard labor jobs, you know what I mean? Like, and that's, you know, their whole life is gone at that point.
Yeah, absolutely, because the system wants to suck you dry. The system doesn't want you thriving and healthy and wealthy and full of vigor in life and being able to challenge it. Sick people don't challenge the system. You know what I'm saying? So people in survival mode don't challenge the status quo, because you're too busy looking at the ground in front of you to look up and see the injustices all around you. And Social Security might not be around by the time you're 70, because they keep talking about the trust fund, the trust fund, the trust fund, and the fact that the Social Security trust fund that they've been borrowing from for the past 50 years is going to not be as abundant as it is now. And the fact that, a lot of people, with the baby boomers getting ready to enter into their retirement ages, that they're going to bankrupt the trust fund because there are so many of them. That's why it's important. And it's a morbid conversation to have that people don't like to have. But that's why it's important to have life insurance, because that's the way that they pass down generational wealth from one generation to the next. That's why it's important to buy a policy, not just a policy to bury you, but a policy that's going to give your family some money when you transition out of here. Um, that's why it's important to do some estate planning and to say, this is what I want to have. I want my children to have when I'm gone. That's why it's important to do those things, because if you don't, then you won't be in a position. You're going to make them start behind the eight ball again, and you won't be in a position to do anything but stay in survival mode.
Yeah, fact. And look, and if you doing all that until you 70, 80 years old, that's pretty much slavery. You know what I'm saying? That's the same thing that like people don't realize. Sometimes slaves got paid money. You know what I mean? Like,
Slaves definitely got paid money. And the thing is that we don't talk about the fact that slaves got paid money and would loan the people that they were enslaved to money, because
right.
slavery was a status, it was an employment situation. And and the reality of the situation is sometimes the slaves were better off in financial terms than the master as far as money that they had access to, because they couldn't spend their money on certain things, because certain stores, like black people during segregation, certain stores wouldn't take their money, so they couldn't spend their money on everything, so they couldn't do anything but save their money. And these masters, these owners would go into debt to their slaves, right? But then they wouldn't pay them back sometimes. So there are all these convoluted relationship dynamics that we don't talk about that happened during our enslavement, when in fact we're still living that reality to this very day, because voluntary servitude, which is employment, which is a job, which is slavery, is still legal. People don't want to understand that drivers who are middle managers are still antagonizing you to get the most production out of you, just like they did during enslavement. These politicians who are drivers, who are political movers and shakers today, would have been drivers in another era, putting the whip to our backs. So now they don't have an actual whip, they have a metaphorical whip. They have an imaginary whip by way of government programs and set asides and taxes that we have to pay and tax refunds that we get. So they can constrict and restrict what we have access to. And that is the whip that we feel.
See, that's why it's important to read right there. You know what I'm saying? Like, is you have I be trying to tell people this, but you say it much more elegant than I do, you know. And and the thing is, like, even like it's like you even the comparison that you just made, like with to the modern slave drivers, right? You'll see a warehouse or something, and all of the office will be, you know, whites and whatever, and then you'll have like one or two, you know, supervisors, and it's always that black supervisor who actually know more about the job and everything that's going on, and they're like, yo, well, we got to make the numbers, we got to make court. And I'm looking at it like, you know, shit, we gonna get paid the same anyway. You ain't gonna get no more money. You ain't getting stock in the company. You're not getting, you know, and they're the ones that are black cops who do the same thing, especially when they be around other white cops. And like you said, the black politicians who, for the most part, we get so individualized to where we only care about the money, you know what I'm saying, which keeps us enslaved, right? Because it's their system, but we co-sign to this system. And don't get me wrong, it's difficult to get out because we can say what we want. I can tell people, hey, you should do this, but if they hungry, like they ain't gonna listen to me. You know what I'm saying? If they need to feed their child, they ain't gonna listen to me. But that's what I was saying. Cause even when they was doing the thing with the jab at my job, like it was like they didn't want to do it. I'm like, well, if we all don't do it, they can't fire everybody. But the thing is, like they're gonna fold because they're like, well, I need this because my bills, you know what I mean? And I understand that, but that's the game, you know, to keep you hooked into the system, you know what I mean? And before I get off here, I got like two quick questions for you. Like the first, you mentioned you know, the life insurance and stuff.
Mhm.
And my question for you, and I still think property, like land itself, is valuable,
Mhm.
especially like depending on what is the land. But you know how they used to be like how passing down houses is like generational wealth. But like, what do you think about that? Like now in the context of like the modern terms.
Passing down land is still valuable, but passing down land is often a debt, and you have to make sure that your children or your progeny have some way to make money to pay for the debt that's on the land. Like I inherited my mother's house, but she still had a mortgage on her house, and she didn't have the type of mortgage insurance that paid off the house upon her death. So I'm still paying a mortgage, I'm still paying taxes, I'm still paying for the house that she passed on to me. I'm grateful for it, right? But it's a debt. And if I were in a bad situation, or if I had another property of my own, then I might not have been able to afford to take on this additional debt to to continue this land, having this land in our family. So, but property is valuable. Property is very valuable. You can develop it. And right now, like what she paid for the house versus what is quote unquote worth in this market is like tripled in value, but that's an inflated value. And I think it's artificial. I think we're heading for another crisis where the mortgage bubble is going to pop because people are paying 2 and 3 times as much for a house in the course of 10 years. You used to have to be in a house 20, 30 years to see those types of returns. And I think that they're offloading bad debt in these mortgages, and they're just waiting for the right time to let us know that no, the mortgage bubble has burst.
Yeah, so they can get another bailout, I guess, you know.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
if that's not stealing, I don't know what is, you know what I'm saying? But
And it's bad because it's not stealing for the average everyday person, right? It's stealing for the corporations. Because if I
yeah.
go, like, if you're going to go and refinance or take out a loan from the house because it has tripled in value in the past 10 years, you need to go buy hard assets that are appreciating. So if I was to take out the equity that I have in this house, I would take out the equity, but I would go buy an apartment building instead of going to
Right.
buy like a car or going to live a better life right now or traveling or anything like that. But we have such a consumerist mindset that oftentimes we are we are geared towards buying things to make us comfortable now. But if I were to take out the equity in my house, I would take out that equity and I would buy an apartment building.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. See, yeah, that's and that's what I was saying about the residual income, you know, income that makes money on its own, you know what I'm saying? Like investments and stuff. That's what helps you get away from somebody else's system. And it could go deeper than all that. Like with us actually, like that's a whole nother scale with us actually working with black people globally, right? Being able to produce, like we could do it just that easily. Like we smart here, they're smart there. We can figure out some kind of way to get resources out of the ground, create materials, do business with each other. Then you can charge other groups or whatever you want. But you know, like that way you can have build houses, build nuclear plants, have all sorts of things, you know, and it could be so easy. But and also like you said with the houses, I'm like I know so many people like they have their own house, but their parents leave their house, and then they end up having to sell it, and then a developer just takes the house, and they could do whatever because they have an advantage because they have the money right then and there that most people don't have, you know.
Mhm.
And yeah, and I
Well,
had one.
and developers, I'm gonna let you speak, but developers also have the advantage and the benefit of knowing all of the different programs that are accessible to them. So, for instance, here in Michigan, they have a program where you don't have to use your income to buy a property. You can buy a property based off of the income that that property is supposed to generate. So they are writing these loans for millions of dollars when they don't have millions of dollars. They're creating money from nothing, saying, well, once the property is developed and finished, I'll have this much money. And then they don't develop the property, and there's no, because a lot of low income housing projects have been left by the wayside during this process, where they were supposed to develop the property into low income housing, but then they don't develop the property, but they just took the money and ran.
Wait, hold on. So you saying like they cannot have the money, but say this land is going to be worth X, Y, and Z, and they could get a loan based off of that.
Correct.
Like,
But you
would
have to correct, but you have to be in the loop of people. Your network has to be in a network of people that can facilitate that particular thing to happen for you. So like I tried it because I was like, well, if that's the case, let me go to the bank and
right? I was about to
try to
say,
try to do this thing, right? And I went to the bank and I had my business plan written up and things like that. And they said, well, you don't have the asset, you don't have the hard money assets to leverage against this type of project. But I have seen poor white people do it. That the poor white people in trailer parks do it, and they walk away from those deals with millions of dollars in their pocket. And then because poor white people have that same consumerist mindset that most black people have, not poor or otherwise, I've seen them do it and go and blow the money, and they don't go to jail, and they lose the land to taxes, and nothing happens to them.
man.
So it's all about who you know.
Yeah, see, because I was that was my I was gonna ask, like, I was like, yeah, I wonder if that will work for black people. I'm sure it won't unless you go into a black bank, but that's goes back to us creating our own institutions, you know.
Right.
And the last thing I wanted to ask you now, are you familiar with the dude Nature Boy?
Man, I saw part of the documentary on
Yeah.
Disney about him, and I'm just like, dude, people really fell for that.
Yo, that's what I wanted to. I started the angle, and maybe I shouldn't even ask you on here, but I'm gonna ask you in the PG way though, because it pissed me off low key. Because looking at black people, that seems to be how it works. You know what I'm saying? Like, if I was to be on here saying certain things, or right, if I start being like, hey, look, I wouldn't do it in a way where I'm God or I'm the prophet, but if I start throwing like Bible verses here and there, you know what I'm saying, and making false promises and lying, you would get people to follow you. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
And if black people is doomed anyway, would it be so wrong for somebody to, start like a cult? You know what I'm saying? Now, my interest would be in the best interest of black people. You know what I'm saying? But it seems to be what black people need. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Black people do need a cult. Black people need a cult of personality, of strong personality. They need I am a fan of the benevolent dictator. So, excuse me, I'm a fan of the benevolent dictator doctrine. A lot of people say, "Oh no, you can't do this, you can't do that," because we have seen what some dictators do. But you can't tell me that all dictators are that way. And white people go out and vote for a strong dictator, a strong dictator, not even a benevolent dictator all the time. So I am of the mindset that if it works, and when we get to talking about religion in about a month or so, then it works, because we have to get to the point where we are meeting our people where they are. And that is where a lot of Black people are. They want to escape from the reality that they're in, and they want a safe place to land. And I think that a cult or a benevolent dictator will give them a safe place to land where they don't have to think about different things. They can just give up their money. They can be told what job they're going to do. They don't have to be told who they're going to marry or different things like that, but they have counselors there for, relationship problems, that are real counselors, that are not interested in having sex with a bunch of people, because I think that's where it goes wrong. Because one of the things I noticed about Nature Boy was that he began to lust after the women
right.
that were in his community, and he began to think that he was God, and he began to think of himself as the most high in and of himself, incarnate, instead of saying I am separate from this internal object. And he's confusing a thing that says God is an internal object, right? God in and of itself is an internal object, but there had to be something or someone that created all of us. We are not just a blip on the screen, you know. So something had to create all of us. And when you tap into that, you get to the point where you have to navigate and negotiate with people about what God is. He was confused and did not have a synthesized doctrine himself, and he was creating it on the fly. And people were coming because Black people want a safe place to land, Black people want a place to escape.
Yeah, and, like yeah, that whole documentary was like, I, first of all, like I was kind of I couldn't because I saw him on the internet like back then, and even the same thing. Not to say nobody's name, but with I don't understand this the whole thing with the dude Young Pharaoh, but like it's like if you say some spooked out stuff, Black people is like, oh yeah, that's absolute. But if I be like, hey, we need to create institutions, and they don't want to hear that, you know what I'm saying? If I be like, oh, in 1967 this happened. No, but if I be like, yeah, well, Jesus said, you know what I'm saying, like, Revelations 13:10, he that killed, they might listen to that, you know what I mean? But like, and like you said, where he went wrong is like, and these was like beautiful women, and like, and the men is like, you can't treat your men in your group like that and expect them to, like, I would expect somebody to rise up and try to kill me, you know what I'm saying? If I
Mm-hmm.
was to treat my men that way and do that to the women and stuff like that. You're not supposed to exploit. You're supposed now. Me, I would put them in position like if I had to pick somebody in history, it would be like Elijah Muhammad. Do you think like another NOI could be made in this day and age?
Yes. I think that another NOI could be made. I think that Christian doctrine can be used. I think that any synthesized doctrine that omits sexual perversion could be used, right, to organize Black people. You just have to, the problem is most of us don't believe in any of those doctrines strongly enough to propagate and promote it out there to the masses, because the way that it has been used, we see the flaws in it. We see the fault lines in it. And it's just like we sit there and it's just like, well, this is a fault. This is a problem. This is this. This is that. And we will not sit there and feed garbage and nonsense to the people in an attempt to organize ourselves. But if you say, listen, you give me 10% of your income, then we're going to, you're going to get a 3% return in 3 years or whatever, however you want to do it, and we can come and we can talk about these books and read these books and read this information, because any book can be a Bible, any book can be an NOI, any book can be an organizing principle if you want it to be. Um, and this is how you dress, and this is the place where you get your clothes from, and this is how you eat, and this is where you get your food from. That's how I believe that religions are economy organizing tools, because they tell you how to eat, who to socialize with, how to dress. They tell you where to get all those things from, with the exception of modern day Christianity, which usually tells you that you can get these things or this appearance of holiness from anywhere, which takes away its economy organizing attributes, which is why mega churches make so much money, because mega churches are just places for you to funnel your money into and you don't get anything out of it. Um, but yes, you could use the NOI, or uh, Gods of the Earth or Christianity or anything to organize people, as long as you stick to the doctrine, because people want to hear the doctrine. People like to hear stories. Oh my gosh, and it sounds so childish, but it's so true. People like to hear stories. They like to hear the mystery. They like to hear the fact that, there's some mysticism in life. And if you can entrance people with the stories and tell them, and this story means, and explain the stories to them and give them meaning, then they will follow you.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you definitely answered my question, right? Because and you said it. I don't understand it, but because what you said was, I always felt like that was the answer, like with the whole church thing, but just in a different way. And I'm not gonna lie, like just looking at that, I was like, yo, being like, but yeah, you're right. You got to keep it, I guess, moral. You know what I'm saying? But that's the thing. Like, if you are going in the right direction where you ain't on that like weirdo stuff, but it's really for like, because black people want to be slaves. Let's be real. You know what I'm saying? Like, well, it seems that way. I'm gonna just say. But if you use that and then you just organize, like the NOI had, and I'm not even saying their doctrine, but like they had black men who will still to this day, if you say something about Elijah Muhammad, be ready to, well, on black people, but you can flip that doctrine to where they be ready to ride. Like you could use that, but like how far are you willing? Well, that was like what I was asking myself. How far are you willing to take it? You know what I'm saying? Like using certain doctrines and stuff like that and the stories that people want to hear, but yeah, I don't want to take up too much of your time though.
You're no, you're perfectly fine. The thing is, again, people like to hear stories and people like to hear those stories explained, right? In a way that they can understand, appreciate, and apply to their lives right now. So, you know, when it comes to using the NOI or anything like that, you have to first, you need a tight network of people that can provide the supportive services like the clothing, the recipes, the food, and things like that that they need. That's one of the things that most religious organizations have, or that the Catholics especially have over any Black organized church or movement, is that they feed people. You can go to a Catholic church and get help with your bills. You can go to a Catholic church and get help with the rent. Excuse me. But you can't go to the average everyday person and say, hey, I need $1,000. Can you help me out? Because most of us don't have an extra $1,000 in our budget to help somebody out. It might be on your heart to help somebody out. You might be able to pray with them that they get the money, but you don't have a tangible asset to give them so that they can get out of the situation that they're in. And what we need in our organizing principles and structures is we need a network, a strong network of people that believe in the mission of the church, and then to organize a church that says, this is the doctrine we're going to espouse. And if this is the doctrine we're going to put out there, this is how we're going to do it. And at the point that you veer from the doctrine, or you decide that you want to be lustful, or you decide that you want to tell people who they can and cannot be in relationship with, well, you're going a step too far, a bridge too far, and you need to come back. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, facts. And I always appreciate hearing what you got to say about it, because honestly, like as far as a collective, I always thought like what you said was probably like, if it's going to be a way besides a catastrophic way, then it would be your way. You know what I'm saying? But and I think that it is possible to get, like, especially when it comes to a certain structure, like you were saying. So yeah, I definitely wanted to ask you that. And it's funny that you did see that documentary. So 'cause I'm like, how they made a documentary about this dude? Like, anyway.
Yeah. I wanted to talk to you about some of the comments that Sister Ross said. She said, yes, I most definitely believe that employment is slavery. She said, here, we work for ourselves, never had a job in her life. Everything we make, we share evenly. Each of us do the work. And then she said, that be the teaching of them caucasoids, the Christianity and the Judeo-Christian understandings of things. And she says, all religions come out of war and conquest overstand. And she's right, but we are at war though. And we need a unifying principle because just being black has not been good enough, because people that are flattening blackness don't bring their money to the party. We can only get them to bring their money to the party when we include some level of mysticism or spirituality about it. You know, we don't get, like, John Hope Bryant, who does this capitalism for all thing, which I am not a capitalist. I am anti-capitalist. And I believe that the things that work for capitalist people will not work and cannot work in mass for Black people, because the system is inherently exploitative. And if the system is inherently exploitative, then you have to augment. You can have external capitalism where you're saying, I can exploit all of the people that are not in my special group. And within my special group, we're going to take care of each other and share money and share resources, which is a form of communalism or a form of socialism. But you have to have internal economic policy and external economic policy. Internal economic policy can be, we all bring 10% of our income to the table. External economic policy is, we all have a 200% markup on anything that we sell to somebody that's not one of us. You know, so we have to have internal and external economic policy.
Yeah. I agree with that. As far, yeah, with the policy, that's what I was saying with the working with other Black people globally. If we were able to get on that accord somehow where we could do business, but like, and because Europeans ain't like, they're not from Africa, but they're gonna say that they are. You know what I'm saying? But Black people is going to deny it, and yeah, the religion thing, and that is a problem, right? But the because I wanted to sing you another one where this girl was like, "Yeah, I'm Christian, I'm not Black, and this pisses me off that blah blah blah." You know what I'm saying? And it's the psychological change until you are able to have a school where you can educate the children from kindergarten on up, from pre-K and all the way up to 12th grade on to college. um I don't know, it's like some you're gonna have to find a way to do this, and then within your doctrine, like, yeah, when we do business with each other, like you said, like, oh well, we have whatever discount for each other, but when we do business outside, we mark up, and so yeah, I definitely agree with that.
One of the things that we don't do enough of, we want to we want to tell everybody our secret sauce instead of just operating with the secret sauce. And that gets us into trouble. So many of our institutions and organizations that benefited Black men, Black women, Black children have been attacked because we tell people this is for Black people only, instead of saying this is for all people, and your board of directors and your board of governors or your trustees or whoever your decision making body are simply decide that only Black people will be the ones that benefit from this program. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, we can't, you can't come out and just say that with a public club. You can say that with a private heritage club, with a legacy club, with a genealogy group. There are a lot of private organizations that you can say, this is just for Black people. And you pull your money and give your money exclusively to Black people, but you cannot take government money. You can take government tax cuts, but you cannot take grants from the government if you do that. And that's where we mess up because we want to take the grants and then we want to say it's all Black. You can't do it that way. You either have to take the money and say it's for all people and then go through your selective process, or you have to not take the money, say it's only for Black people, and you have to take tax cuts. And that's how the system is set up because there are a lot of private country clubs, private heritage clubs, legacy clubs. White people have all types of underground organizations that we've never heard of, or we've never heard anything about, that benefit strictly white people, that that pool their money together to do the things that they want to do. But they don't go about taking government money to get their goals accomplished. They have their own revenues and their own money that comes into those organizations to create those opportunities for those people. So, start a heritage club. We can start one now. We can start a we can start a heritage club. We can start a genealogy group. We can say, okay, we're coming together for the purpose of investigating genealogies and making grants and scholarships for Black boys and girls that want to go into plumbing or want to go into the skilled trade, nursing, plumbing, electricians, AI, STEM, this, that, and the other. And it's only for Black people. And we can do that. And then you can have like the oldest member get an insurance policy on them. And that insurance policy, when they die, will fund the rest of those scholarships because they're going to probably die first. You know, these are not easy things to talk about when you're talking about the individuals that you're dealing with specifically, but in broad terms, it's easy to talk about, to say, listen, it makes sense for the oldest person in the group to have a life insurance policy that we all help pay for so that this organization can get off the ground, and when they die, their death is going to fund these scholarships for these types of people, and it's going to be Black only.
Nah, facts. That's a great idea. And that's why like we should start thinking systematically instead of personally. You know what I'm saying? Because yeah, it's hard to have a personal conversation if you, but yo, it's just the system. It's how it works. And that organization is probably what we need. So like, yeah, I agree with that 100%.
Hmm. But
But
yeah,
yeah,
these are the like you said, it's a system, and we have to get beyond the fact that the system is against us, but we can be for ourselves and we can be for each other, and we can organize and strategize so that we are using the resources that we have available in the most strategic way. Because unfortunately, every dynasty and legacy started with a crime and a death. Every single one of them.
yeah, that's
Every
deep.
single one of them. A crime and a death. So either it got funded by an insurance policy or they were robber barons.
Yeah, isn't that how the Kennedys got their money?
Yes. Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and I do, and also like you said, with the thing, because like what they started doing was passing those literacy tests and certain things to get admitted. You know what I'm saying? So like, yeah, but yeah, I need to look into those legacy. What is it, legacy? group or something.
Legacy group or heritage club. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, and you know, the thing about something like that is you set up your own rules. So you can, you know, Google heritage clubs, legacy groups, legacy membership organizations. You can Google stuff like that and you can see how other people have set them up. But you can do it as simple as saying, you know, um, all members must be African American or have at least two African American grandparents. You can say all members must provide a donation or contribution of 15% of their annual income or $1,500, whichever is less. You can say the purpose of this organization is to establish scholarships and grants for uh, Black boys and girls ages up to age, you can say up to age 24, 14, 34. You can go, or for Black people, you can say Black men and women to go into these particular types of fields. And you get two other people that you trust to be on your board of trustees. And then you start the application, and then you start creating an application, you know, that has their name, address, phone number, email address, GPA, what their goals are, and have them write an essay, and that's it. I mean, you know, it can be just that simple.
Yeah, yeah, that's and I don't mean to like keep going, but I definitely enjoy talking to you because you always have great ideas, and you know what I be talking about, and you put it in a much better way. But like, one thing that I say, like, if like especially voting, we could take some successful black business people. I ain't saying like famous or nothing, but just successful black business people and put them on the council or whatever, and we vote for it or whatever. And they strictly fund and help grow black businesses, put them in our neighborhoods, all the stuff we need, grocery stores, whatever the case may be, and we all can contribute to it, like whether it be like $1 or $1,000 or $1 million or whatever, but of course they got to stay transparent, you know what I'm saying? But it's the unorganization, that we have, because like the only way that it's like they have time to have think tanks and all of these commissions and all sorts of stuff to keep their stuff organized, and they um make the rules. They do whatever they want to do, you know what I'm saying, like, because the law is only as good as you enforce it or as they want to, but they keep what they have organized, but they also make plans ahead of time, and they don't just, like they have 100-year plans, they have plans for 2 generations from now, but we're thinking about tomorrow, what we gonna do for the weekend or the game tonight, you know what I mean? So it's hard to organize as far as like, as like you're saying, but all it takes is the like-minded people to start something and to get somewhere, you know what I'm saying? So I don't know.
Oh, you're absolutely right. It just takes like-minded people. That's why the most important thing of any plan or strategy that you have is to find your group. You have to find the group of people wherever they may be. I like to say 5 people so you can make a fist. 5 people that really are focused on what you're focused on, and to have transparency between you to organize and strategize so that you can build something real. Um, we don't have the benefit of being in the same states, so it makes it a little bit harder. But finding 5 people that are in your state, we can cross state lines and start a online heritage group and say, listen, everybody give up $5 a month, and until we get to the point where somebody passes away, or we get to the point where somebody, has a windfall, or we want to pay for these different services with that $5 a month, or whatever it is we want to do with that $5 a month, we can do that so that we're able to start building something. And then we have something to talk to people about when we talk to them locally, to say, well, I'm a part of a heritage club. And what do? We get together and we read books and we research our genealogy and we look up strong African American or Black ancestors internationally and we tell their stories. It can be as simple as that. And
Yeah.
then, your longer term, the longer term goals can be to do those scholarships and things like that. We could start that right now. Like the birthday club is a good idea, but people don't have enough buy-in to do the birthday club on a consistent basis because they don't want to go to meetings. And that's the other thing. People have to decide to come to meetings, whether it's an online meet and greet or it's a real life in the real world meet and greet. People have to decide to meet, to talk about the different things, to have a phone conversation, to do a Zoom call so that they're exchanging ideas and they are filtering those things out with one another about what it is that they actually want to do.
No, facts, facts, and that's that's the only way that it's gonna happen is like off of here. Like here is for I use my platform for propaganda purposes, but it's the truth. I'm telling the truth, but it's to get on my. But you're right. Like anything that's gonna happen is to be offline, you know. And the last thing I'll say, like even when we was doing it, like my friend had an idea about because you mentioned it like the birthday club, but she had an idea of like the birthday challenge where whoever it was only five of us, but it was pretty good. You get 20, it was just $20, but it was just five of us. So like everybody put in $5 for whoever birthday it is, you know. And the only qualification was you just had to participate for everybody's birthday. You can't just get it and you don't put in for everybody else either, though. You know what I'm saying? And yeah,
Hmm.
like little things like that. And but yeah, it's hard to have groups because like people have egos. Everybody want to make decisions but don't want to be in charge. Like they want you to go with their plan. Like, but like, yo, we can support each other. That's the point, is to support each other. But yeah, definitely. But yeah, I appreciate you for letting me come on here and talk to you about this. And because yeah, you got so many good ideas, and I definitely wanted to hear what you had to say about some of this stuff. I know sometimes I go like I'm an extremist, so I go all the way to the end. But yeah, sometimes you gotta take the baby steps and stuff. So
I would be classified as a Black identity extremist because my niece, she was like, Titi, you're racist. And I was
yeah,
like, and she said it with such, it was so innocent. She said, Titi, you're racist. I said, I'm not racist. I'm not powerful enough to be racist. My dislike for non-Black people and ignorant people has no impact or effect on their lives. However, you better not bring home a white boy.
yeah, that's all. You better know that. You can say what you want to say. Don't come in with no damn white boy.
So,
Yeah.
but I would be considered a Black identity extremist because I really believe that as African people on this planet, we have the superior genetics and intellect to deal with the dynamics, and we are the true guardians and treasurers of this planet. I believe that our place on this planet has been co opted and stolen by an interloper that we felt compassionate for because they weaponized our compassion against us. We saw them withering in the sun and we wanted to take care of them. And then it was just like, well, they're people too, or they have the same organs that we have too. And we bred with them and we let them breed with each other. And and what has happened over time is they have integrated their way into our social structure and then they bred back with each other instead of breeding with us because they saw us as their adversaries. They have an adversarial relationship with this planet. We have a much more balanced relationship with this planet because we see it as a resource, not as something to exploit.
Yeah, facts. And also, and I will say this too. Well, everybody call me racist, but yeah, thank you. Why aren't you? But like. And by the way, prejudice means to prejudge. And after all of these thousands of years, we ain't prejudging anything. So we're not even prejudiced. So,
Hmm.
but yeah, that's an honor. I see that as a badge of honor to be called that. And hopefully I could get my nephew on the right track. He better not pull up with no damn white girls. I could tell you that. So, but
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, you just have to tell them young. And you have to tell them the stories because one of the things that I reinforce with my nieces, I reinforce with her that just like we are our ancestors, they are their ancestors. And they will lynch you, they will get you in a isolated location and try to rape you. They are their ancestors. They will beat you, they will call you the N word, and then they will try to have sex with you because they are that depraved. And just like we are our ancestors, where we are strong and we are fearless and we fought back and we set things on fire and we, and some of us are at the point where we are about to explode all the time. We are our ancestors, they are their ancestors. Because ancestors never die. Energy is neither, and this is the principle, energy is neither created nor destroyed, it is just transferred. So the energy of their ancestors lives in them, and the energy of your ancestors live in you. And that's why you have to know who your ancestors are so that you can know what energy you carry so that you can balance yourself and rectify yourself in this world.
Nah, that's deep right there. That's all facts, yo. I'm sorry. There's one more thing I wanted to tell you, right? Because like just promoting the book, I'll put my like the link for it like on black platforms with like talking about the particular subject of slavery. You know what I'm saying? And nobody looks at that stuff more than racist white people. You know what I'm saying? And I know for sure that my mom would probably be the first one to sell me down the river because like yo they like once they get destroyed, you know what I'm saying, like because I don't debate with them. I just I've learned the art of trolling them because they're kind of dumb. They say something racist to you and then you say repeat what they say back to them and then they call you racist. But then like one thing they do is start going to my personal page and like comment under my pictures and stuff like that, you know what I'm saying? And I just be like, well, look, I can tell like this is that homosexual Greek culture that you guys practice, you know what I'm saying? Obsession with black men, but then, my family see that, but like that's the thing. You know how many of them call me the N-word just for like on a black site for talking about black history and they've called me the N-word. I know who they are. Like even on like I used to have a call-in thing. They used to call in playing songs about lynching the N-word and all this stuff. I know who they are, but people don't believe me, you know what I'm saying? But I'm sorry, that was a whole thing out of nowhere, but something you said made me think of that, but I just had to say that.
They are their ancestors. So the cowards that called Martin Luther King and Malcolm X that called and would just want to say nigger, 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 you a dead nigger, you a this nigger, you a that nigger, that energy still lives in them. And they still will play out those roles until and unless they decide to stop it. And they don't want to stop it because for them it gives them relevance in this world because that's the only time and place where they can feel like they matter, where they feel powerful and strong and in control, when in fact that is them playing to their lower level selves, playing to the basis aspects of their personalities, and they don't even have an idea of what it is that they're actually saying or doing or showing themselves to be, which is less than a Neanderthal.
Yeah, facts. But but you know what hurts me though is the fact that my mom would see them saying racist stuff on the thing about me, but then her argument will be not all of them are bad. You should leave them alone because not all of them is bad. Like, but I'm
Your
sick of it.
mom is probably of the same generation that my mom was in, which is, segregation happened during her lifetime, but she was a part of that integrated whole new world. She bought into the idea that some of the white people that she would interact with would be okay. She might have a white friend at work. Um, and you have to, you know, the fact that she would sell you down the river is disturbing because that was, I wouldn't say that about my mom, but I would say that a lot of people of a certain age between 55 and 70 feel like not all of them are bad because they had to deal with that reality and live in that reality. Because if they face the ugly truth, they would be put in a position where they're like, well, why did my parents send me to school with these people? Why am I going to work with these people? Why am I in a position where I'm a defenseless child put in this situation with this white supremacist that would rather see me lynched and hanging from a tree than in the safety of my own all black school?
Nah, yeah, that's true. That's true. And I just wanted to be clear, and I wouldn't say, my mom doesn't look. When I say sell me down the river, if I was Micah Johnson, she would give up everything that I like. Yeah, here's his stuff. He gonna be there at this time. You know what I'm saying? That's all I meant.
Mhm.
But
Oh, okay.
yeah,
Okay. Okay. Because, we have to be clear about these things.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Because, we have to, we have to give them some grace because they grew up in a time where integration was sold to them as the whole, as the next wave of humanity. That was the evolutionary phase of what we were going through. We were all going to be one great big human family, the melting pot. Black little boys and white little girls, and white little boys and black little girls was all going to sit there, and we were going to be judged by the content of our character and not the color of our skin. And that's just not the world that we will ever live in because they don't want it that way. We're
yeah.
we're never
Facts.
going to live in that world because they can't handle us being on equal terms because we are the superior human being.
Yeah. Well, it's like I told her that, well, that generation, the civil rights generation, is retiring, and I ain't about to be the decision makers no more, so I ain't worried about it no more now.
Well, that's true, but the challenge is that all of the laws that the civil rights generation used to leverage those decisions to make different rules, like the Voting Rights Act, which considered race in redistricting, they're reversing all of those things. So we'll be fighting their fight, having none of the benefit of their knowledge base, starting from square one, because no, they haven't taken the right to vote from us, but they're diluting our votes. You know what I'm saying? They're
Yeah,
diluting our votes. And if they dilute our votes, then it's going to be just like it's just going to be just like we don't matter anyway. It's going to be like we don't matter anyway.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, all I say is like, well, they operate by systems. Is like we've been saying, like it's time for us to create a system for us to operate that offers us a level of protection that we won't ever go beyond, but only we can do that for us. You know what I'm saying? And we don't have nobody's gonna come and save us. So some like maybe I'm wrong because I'd be like. I think we needed this wake up call, like because we got too comfortable, like. But that's just me because I understand that I know it's a complicated thing. You know what I mean? So
We needed this wake up call, but I think Donald Trump 1 was the wake up call. Donald Trump 2.0 was us being apathetic And as he continues to gut our rights and to take away benefits and privileges that we had as a collective group, and we're going to start to move differently in the world. We're going to have to physically decide to move near one another so that the Black vote matters again. We used to live in neighborhoods and in community with each other. And like, even though I'm in Detroit, Detroit is gentrified. You know what I'm saying? And we have to get to the point where we're moving back into neighborhoods and communities with one another so that we're not so sparsely divided. Like, my mother did not want to go to an area where she was the only or the first or anything like that. So I have quite a few Black neighbors. But I see the white people peeking their heads up through, coming through the neighborhood, walking their little dogs, you know.
Yeah.
um, but, we have to get to the point where we are building community with one another again, where we're deciding to come together and say, this is what we want, where we can, as a collective, where we're not a lonely voice or a simple stone being thrown into an ocean of ideas where we can get tossed to and fro. We have to concentrate our vote. So we may have to move into neighborhoods where we're around more Black people.
Right. Yeah, and yeah, that sound like my old neighborhood. My parents bought it in the '80s. It was a middle class neighborhood, but it was all Black people. But now it's like about 5, 6 white neighbors. Like the old lady next door to my mom, she died and gave it to her son, and he sold it to some white people. So now
Mhm.
she living next to a white people. So that whole Black middle class neighborhood is gone. So yeah, that's true. But yeah, and I know you've been on here for 3 hours. I'm sorry. I do enjoy conversations with you. So
I enjoy conversations with you as well. You're fine.
yeah, I appreciate it. I appreciate it. And shouts out to Raw in the building. And but no, I definitely agree with you. We're gonna have, but I do say though, because I think that we've lost the concept of it wasn't. I believe that like when they say Black people, whatever, it was for the right for representation though as well, not just picking between just whoever. It was to have representation for us.
It was to have representation for us. The Voting Rights Act was about us being able to be represented in government. It wasn't about the fact that we got to pick between the lesser of two evils, or we got to pick between the Democrat that has benignly neglected us and the Republican that is just going to that's going to ignore us. It was about it was about us being able to have representation and us being able to have an actual voice in the political process. And so once they dilute that voice, it becomes problematic because we're not going to be one consolidated shout saying yes or no. We become a hollow voice in a crowded room saying yes in a room full of no's, or saying no in a room full of yeses. And that's what the Voting Rights Act is taking away from us, is putting us in that position.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I ain't really look at. I mean, I ain't really look at it that way. So yeah, that's definitely fair. I can definitely appreciate that.
But we needed this wake up call, and we need to stop letting them put our petty differences in front of us as though this is what's going to divide us. We need Black men and Black women to come back together again and decide they're going to build a Black family. We need the young and the old to come back together again and decide they're going to be in community with each other, so that the young people can learn something from the living libraries that are just sitting there empty, which are the old people. The adults, the older adults are living libraries that have stories and histories inside of them that young people don't even go into. They don't even talk to them. The old people are scared to talk to the young folks. The young folks think the old people are crazy and don't know nothing. So we have to get to the point where we see each other as allies and as community members again, instead of just, oh, that's a young thug, or oh, that's an old head that don't know nothing.
Yeah, yeah, because I know black people that be like, oh, that's a hood black person. Like, but then you meet the person and they're like the nicest person. They just happen to live in the what they would call the hood, you know. But even now, you see white girls running down with. Oh, here they had like Jackson Ward. You know what I'm saying? In the '90s, it was a problem. It was like top five crime city, or whatever. Now it got redeveloped and they building new apartments and all sorts of white people is moving in, and even the hood, they're moving them out and scattering even that area. So it's a whole plan, there's a whole system to it, like, you know. So yeah, but the only way is for us to and learning how to agree to disagree. You know what I'm saying? Because even
Hmm.
if we disagree, it don't mean we're not cool. It don't mean we should be on bad terms or any of that kind of stuff. You know what I'm saying? But even that, we seem to struggle with being able to agree to disagree. You know?
Well, we have to get past the idea that somebody has to be right and somebody has to be wrong.
Exactly.
We look at things as though we have been taught to look at things as though somebody must be right and somebody must be wrong, instead of the fact that we are different. We can look at things, and you can see a an octagon, right? And I can see a red stop sign, and we're describing the same thing. We're describing the same phenomena, but we're seeing it differently, and we're describing it differently, and we could just agree to disagree, and it'd be fine, because we're both looking at the same set of facts, and we can agree on that. Do you see a
Yeah.
shape?
Yeah. Facts. And yeah, because one thing ought to be well said, if I learned how to talk to people better, I would probably have more friends. But that's what made her ought to be well. But I feel that 100% because you know sometimes I do need to have more of a filter with certain people. So,
You're
but
just growing. You're growing. That's all. And it's okay to grow. I don't think you necessarily need more or less of a filter. I think that sometimes one of the things they took from us was our language and our ability to communicate with one another. During our enslavement, we had a slave language that we spoke, we had the white man's language that we spoke, and then we had our native tongue that we spoke when we were talking to our countrymen. So that right there tells you that most enslaved people spoke two, if not three, different languages in an attempt to communicate with one another. When they began to make it illegal for us to read, to write, to speak certain languages, to communicate with one another, they took away our ability to express internal understandings and ideas that we have in our mind. So if you don't even have words to put across to a person about the idea that you have in your mind, because that language has been taken from you, what are you supposed to do other than have an argument?
yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's all facts. And yeah, it's meant to be keep us divided so they can be empowered. But yeah, I keep saying I'm gonna go because I'm gonna let you wrap it up. I know you're tired and ready to get off of here, but yeah, thank you for letting me come on here and speak and answering my questions, and you know I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for coming up, Forecast. I always appreciate your input and your commentary. I always value your ideas, because it's always good to hear what you have to say, because you represent the next generation under me, because I'm almost 50. So you're like almost what, 30? So
Nah, I'm about to be 40 now. Well, no, I'm
okay,
like
well,
38.
okay. So you about to be 40, I'm about to be 50. So that's that 10-year gap. So I respect the fact that you coming up here and you want to talk to me and, discuss these different things. So thank you for coming up.
All right, all right. I appreciate you, and shouts out to Raw, and I thank you, and great live too, by the way.
Thank you. I want to say thank you to Ra and the elders that were listening with her, and KW Don 7, as well as Bawana Haguziki, who I know is listening, and Anthony McPhail and Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I know you guys are listening. And Redo 9002. I appreciate each and every one of you for being here, and I will see you on Tuesday. Peace, guys.